So when we talk about evolution, typically people are thinking in terms of evolution by natural selection. So there's some natural diversity that's just produced intrinsically from the way that biology works. And individuals in a population are going to vary some way or another. And some of them will do better in a given environment. And that environment is sort of selecting them. And that's the process of natural selection. Can you just define for us what is natural selection? And is that the only thing that explains the diversity that we see in biology, or even the main thing?
Yeah, so you did a pretty good, provided a pretty good definition of natural selection. I view natural selection as the most powerful, one of the most powerful forces in the biological world. If you have variation, and that variation exists at the genetic level and can be inherited from parent to offspring, and it's related to differences in fitness among individuals, then natural selection will occur. The bigger question is how powerful selection is. It's not all powerful. And natural selection can only promote certain changes that are significant enough at the level of fitness differences uh, in association with the phenotypic changes. That's what natural selection can do. But many mutations have very, very tiny effects. And in certain lineages of organisms, those effects are small enough that selection can't grab onto them and push them onto the next generation. This gets into the whole idea of noise in the evolutionary process.
Hmm.
So all would work fine, and natural selection would be capable of almost anything if populations were infinite in size and everything was deterministic. But nothing in biology is deterministic. Populations are finite in size. There's a lot of noise due to the fact that a mutation arises here and whoops, another bad one arises linked right next to it. And it's no longer has a net selective advantage and so on. So there's this noise in the evolutionary process we call drift, random genetic drift. And if that level of noise is high enough so that the magnitude of fluctuations in allele gene frequencies from generation by the noise process, if that exceeds the deterministic push by natural selection, then drift wins. So there's this sort of fine point where we call this the drift barrier. There's this fine point where the two forces are essentially equivalent. If you go over to one edge far enough, then selection wins. If you go over to the other edge far enough, then random genetic drift wins. And so we think that, especially at the genomic level, drift wins in many, many cases in certain phylogenetic lineages.
Hmm. So if I'm understanding you, the bigger the population is, the more individuals in a population, the easier it is for natural selection to act in the way that we normally think about it, for it to push changes, quote unquote, on purpose into the next generation because they have better fit, they're better matched to the environment. But the smaller the population, the more likely it is for this noise to dominate and for natural selection not to be able to work so well. And so I would imagine that as you sort of go from one branch of the tree of life to another, as you go from something like E. coli or simple organisms that have very, very large populations to something like us, even though there's a few billion people on Earth, that still probably pales in comparison to the population of E. coli, swimming around out there. That would mean that this sort of drift dominates in the sort of the physically bigger organisms because they have smaller populations.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description. I mean, there's a negative relationship between the size of an organism and its population size. That's certainly true.
Mm-hmm.
And bacterial populations are literally astronomical in number. Um, it's a little more complicated than that. Something I was alluding to is that the only determinant of the magnitude of drift is not just numbers of individuals. It's also the fact that our genes are tied together on chromosomes.
Mm.
And this causes selective interference. So the if genomes could be constructed in such a way that every nucleotide were separate, then natural selection could operate on each nucleotide in a separate way. But we're all linked together on genotypes, and that causes what's called selective interference.
I see. So if I get a mutation that's in a gene on one chromosome and it makes me better at
Yeah,
surviving in some way, but then I have another mutation on the same chromosome in a different gene and that makes me worse, those things can cancel out because I have to inherit that whole chromosome all at once.
yeah, that's one thing that can go on. That's called selective interference. Another kind of uh, selective interference that's very, very broad-based as far as we know, that occurs in all organisms is related to the fact that most mutations are deleterious.
Mm.
And so there's this constant rain of deleterious mutations coming down on all chromosomes and all organisms. And then those are being weeded out of the population. And when they're pulled out of the population, they pull out any linked genes with them. And so, in a sense, the population size can remain really large numerically, but genetically, it's behaving as though it's quite small because you have this persistent purging of variation that would otherwise be there in an physically enormous population.
Mm. So
So,
if most mutations are deleterious and you're purging those from the population, this means that inevitably you're going to be taking away new adaptations at some rate, even though they would be adaptations because they're tied to these deleterious mutations.
yeah, in some sense, yeah. So this becomes a really powerful force. So, bacteria, like an E. coli population has an effect, what we call an effective population size, which is very different, absolute, of only about a billion individuals. That's a very tiny pile of E. coli cells. But genetically, the population is behaving that way in a genealogical sense. Still, that's a lot of individuals. And that allows natural selection to be quite effective. It can basically take advantage of mutations that have an effect
Mm-hmm.
roughly one over the population size, an effect as small as 10 to the minus 9 on fitness. Uh,
Um, what about human beings? What would do we know humanity's effective population size?
well, there's a lot of us on the planet today, but historically, the human effective population size, you know, there's a lot of us today, but that wasn't true even 10,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, the human effective size is only about 10 to the fourth individuals. And, numbers like that are common for lots of vertebrates and even some invertebrates.
So,
And
so
that
in other
means,
words, even though there's billions of people walking around on the planet today, genetically, the diversity we have looks like we're a population of tens of thousands.
yeah, that's right. New diversity generated by mutation hasn't quite caught up. We're what you would call out of equilibrium.
Mm.
Um, But the point here is that these reductions in population size, especially in multicellular organisms, mean that natural selection is going to be much more coarse grained. It can only take advantage of mutations of relatively large effect, large enough to overcome the power of drift, whereas uh, selection in bacteria can be very, very fine grained. Things can be very, very fine tuned over evolutionary time.
And so, is it so? So, can you give us? So, you said most mutations are deleterious. So, you get a genetic mutation, it can harm the organism's chance for survival. It could enhance the organism's chance for survival, or it could just be a wash. It could be neutral, somewhere in the middle. Can you give us a sense for how common each of those is? Like are adaptive mutations like very, very, very rare? Are there a lot of mutations that are sort of neutral and they don't really matter so much? Or is everything just, it's 99% of everything deleterious?
Yeah, that's a good question too, that evolutionary geneticists are still struggling with. We're trying to catalog what's called the distribution fitness effects among all de novo mutations. What fraction are beneficial? What fraction are deleterious? And of the beneficials, how many are so close to, they're very, very slightly beneficial, selection can't take advantage of them. In general, we think that only a small fraction are beneficial. Maybe 1% or so of mutations are beneficial. Most are deleterious, and that's just a consequence of the eons of natural selection refining uh, structures and functions in organisms, so that most tweaks are going to make things worse.
Mm-hmm.
But things do move on when organisms are exposed to new adaptive challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, when we look at animals and other creatures, and when we think about why they got to be the way they are, there's this natural tendency in evolutionary biology to think about things in adaptive terms. And we say, like, okay, this animal's got a really long tail, or it's got horns, or it's got this or that. We naturally want to think, okay, why did that evolve, in the sense of how are those adaptations for the organism? How did it enhance the organism's survival? But if these sort of neutral and random processes can be so strong, especially in relatively large organisms with small populations, what does that start to tell us about, like, how much of what we see in the tree of life actually evolved by natural selection and is adaptive, versus how much of it is just basically random or close to it?
Yeah, well, that's a broad issue that we're still struggling with.